is indeed a pleasure to have David Marsich here. He is an assistant professor of history at Germanna Community College, where he has taught since 2013. He holds an MA from the University of Kentucky, as well and is a PhD candidate at George Mason University in the field study of U.S. history, early American and American religious history. We are delighted that David served on the Washington Heritage Museum's board from 2017 to 2021. Church, State, and Freedom in Early America, and I welcome David Marsich.
Well, I want to thank the Washington Heritage Museums for the opportunity to speak here today, and especially Gail, Ethan, and Ann for helping to facilitate this. So I tell my students, right, when we talk about religion and politics, we're going to talk about the things that your parents tell you never to speak about in polite company. So I don't know what that says about the company here today, but this entire talk is about religion and politics in the early part of the United States. But I do think that these are two things that are important to discuss. Both religion and politics speak to the beliefs, deeply held beliefs oftentimes, of individuals, beliefs that shape their views of the world, that shape their actions. Religion and politics both shape the institutions, right? Governments and churches, right? That in turn shape society and alter how people live. And it's, I think, really important to recognize that churches and governments were deeply connected for much of early American history. And so my intention this morning is really just to propose to you 5 big ideas that I think help us understand the relationship between the church and the state in the early American British colonies. You know, when you give a talk, there's kind of two directions you can go in, I think, right? You can go very specific, right? You can talk about one person's life over the course of 2 years, right? And everything from the buttons they had on their coat to what they had for breakfast. Or you can go big and offer a sense of scope, right? That sort of 30,000 feet up in the air altitude view of things. And that's what I'm going for here today. So, first big idea that I want to propose to you, right, is that historically, the state and religion were really deeply connected in Europe. Now, certainly there were tensions between church officials and princes over where one's authority ended and another's authority began. But by and large, the church and state in Europe supported each other. They were mutually supporting. The church was often seen as a pillar of public order, right? It helped prescribe morality. It helped suggest what was appropriate and inappropriate behavior. And the state helped enforce those moral codes and in turn received legitimacy from the church, right? Kings and princes, when they received their office, right, often did so with the blessing of the church. Even in the Reformation, right, as it played out in the 1500s, right, the birth of a Protestant Christianity in Europe, the Reformation didn't really challenge the assumption that the state and the church were connected. Kings, whether they were Protestant or whether they were Catholic, still insisted that their subjects follow the official faith of the state, which was not coincidentally oftentimes the same faith as that king or that prince. Religious dissent, right? Differences of religious opinion, as a result, were often seen as seditious, as illegal, right? If the king to whom you hold allegiance, who claims he's in that position by the will of God himself, says that the Catholic faith is the right faith, or says that we're going to do what John Calvin says we're going to do, and we're going to become Reformed Christians, and you challenge that, well, that's flirting with treason, right? As much as it is flirting with what you believe to be following your conscience. So the Reformation doesn't really introduce this broad idea of religious freedom. What it does is it creates really religious divisions among the kingdoms of Europe. Famously, in England, Henry VIII in the 1530s severed his kingdom's connection with the Catholic Church and established a Church of England, right? What we could also refer to as the Anglican Church, right? It's the sort of larger body that the United States' own Episcopal Church has a connection to today. The head of state, right? Henry VIII, for much of the early 1500s, and later his children and their successors were the head of this English church. The sovereign remained the head of that official state church. And by the early 1600s, this Church of England had become more and more Protestant in character, in its doctrines and in its teachings, but it remained connected to the king's government. The king appointed high-ranking church officials, bishops served in Parliament, in the House of Lords, in turn kind of furthering that connection between church and state, and laws mandated church attendance by the population. People paid taxes in England that helped support the upkeep of the Church of England, and even the royal seal was displayed in Anglican churches across the realm. I used to interpret down at Jamestown Settlement, and one of the most common questions that people had when they would walk into our recreation of a church, an Anglican church there, was, what's that seal right up in the front behind the altar? And then, well, that's James's seal, right? I mean, that's the king's seal. So that's that intertwining of church and state. The official church supported by taxes, sanctioned by the laws of the state. So that's my whirlwind tour of this relationship between church and state in Europe very broadly, and more specifically in England with the Church of England. My colleagues at Germanna who teach European history right now are having a small heart attack, right? Thinking that I tried to cover this in approximately 5 minutes. So don't tell them, right? Don't tell them. Big idea number 2, right? So we've given you some broad context. We're moving on to something a little bit more specific to early America. Second big idea is that many colonies established churches. And that word established is important. It means something specific. Many colonies had established churches that granted legal privileges, gave a special position to one church over another. As the colonies were established in the 17th and 18th centuries, many colonists simply imported, they brought with them that official Church of England. Not every colonist coming to the British colonies is fleeing religious persecution. Many of them were seeking to stamp British North America with British culture, right? And part of that culture was the Church of England, right? In fact, when they looked at the process of colonization as a contest, as a rivalry, they looked what Catholic Spain had been doing in Latin America. They looked what Catholic France had been doing up in New Canada, right? Up in New France, in Canada, down in Louisiana. They were importing the Catholic Church, right? They were converting Native Americans into that faith. They were bringing it with them. So for many British colonists, they imported the Church of England along with them, rather than seeking to flee it. Many colonies had, again, what is termed an established church, and that's an important keyword, meaning the church was recognized as official by the colonial government, and it was granted special legal privileges. It also meant that that church was tax supported. So I'm going to talk about 2 examples of colonies with established churches, Virginia and Massachusetts, although there's many others. So, turning to Virginia, The 104 men and boys who arrived at Jamestown in 1607 brought with them the Church of England, planting it in the soil as much as they would later plant tobacco. By 1610, the government at Jamestown had passed something called the Laws Divine, Moral, and Martial to help the colony survive in the wake of the starving time. These were imposed as sort of martial law upon the colonies, mandating things like military service for settlers and proposing harsh punishments for people who broke the law. Those laws, divine, moral, and martial, included mandatory church attendance at the Church of England several times a week, and it also prescribed punishments against things like blasphemy. Right? So within 2 or 3 years, right, of Virginia being established, we see laws being put into effect that in many ways try to instill a sort of religious discipline upon the colony. And as Virginia matured, it imported institutions from England that were adapted to the conditions of the Chesapeake region. Parishes in Virginia had to be bigger, and they had to include multiple congregations because the population in Virginia was spread out, right, by the late 1600s along isolated farms and plantations, and there were relatively few ministers ordained by the Church of England who had traveled to the colonies. So parishes were bigger, they had to include multiple congregations, and as the colony grew and expanded, the parishes were divided up, they multiplied to accommodate a larger territory. A shortage of qualified pastors also meant that they often traveled the parish, visiting different congregations on different Sundays. Right? So one of the consequences of this is that parishes had to become more independent. The laity, right, non-ordained people in the parishes, often had to lead church services on Sundays when the pastor was somewhere else, often reading from things like the Book of Common Prayer. And it also meant that vestries, right, the lay leadership of Anglican churches, became far more important to the governance of those churches than they really were in England. The vestries, members of the vestries served for life. They wielded the power to hire and fire ministers who traveled and preached on Sundays. In other ways, administered the parishes. So, freeholders, and by freeholders we're talking about the heads of households who essentially led farms, who hired servants, who enslaved Africans, who brought their wives and children over with them to Virginia. Freeholders had to pay an assessment, a tax, each year to support the Church of England, to support that establishment in Virginia. This assessment was based on how many laboring people they had in their household. The more people capable of producing profit that you had, the more servants, the more slaves, the higher the assessment. The average assessment for the church in colonial Virginia was 35 pounds of tobacco. To give you some form of comparison, the county assessment, the tax charged by the secular authority of the region, was a mere 14 pounds.
Wow.
Now this tax, I want to make it clear, this is not evidence of British tyranny, right? The bishops back in London aren't arching their fingers and saying, we're going to tax the colonists and make them pay more tobacco to go to church. No, that's not what's happening. These taxes were decided at the provincial level. This was being done in Williamsburg, right? This was being done by the Virginians themselves because they saw it as important. And these taxes went not only to fund upkeep and maintenance, but to pay the clergy salary. It also contributed to things like poor relief and care for orphans. And this was a burden borne by the church in this era rather than by the state. I'm just going to linger on this for a moment, but this is selected provisions for the poor in a particular parish in Virginia in the mid-18th century. And what this is essentially showing you is the accounts that the parish paid out to people like doctors, right? The third from the bottom, to Mr. John Keeling for keeping Benjamin Burroughs. Well, it's very likely that Mr. John Keeling had taken in an orphan or someone who was incapable of caring for himself, and so the parish paid him a stipend for taking care of that individual, right? So things like doctor's bills, the care of widows and orphans, or people who were disabled, people who were in poverty, that was a burden borne by the parish, and that parish was able to bear that burden because the colony taxed households in order to support it. Another way that the laws of the colony supported these, essentially the established church, was by enforcing morality. The laws, in many ways, were informed by a morality of Protestant Christianity, and so that meant that there were laws against blasphemy, laws against sodomy and adultery and other affronts against sexual morality, at least considered at the time. These crimes were tried by a county court on a monthly basis, and they administered fines and public punishments. So that means that people caught in a state of public drunkenness for swearing and for cursing, right? For, you look at the last one, right? For having sex out of wedlock, right? I mean, these were crimes that, if public enough, right, people could be dragged before the county court and charged a fine, or perhaps publicly humiliated. So I told you I was going to talk about Virginia, right? And I think I'm contractually obligated to do that since we're in the Commonwealth. But we're also going to shift to Massachusetts in my attempt to demonstrate that this isn't just a Virginia thing. So, in the years after the settlement of Virginia, the character of English Christianity was contested. This is going to come as a shock, but people disagreed about how to worship, right? Back in the United Kingdom, the Church of England really faced a challenge in offering a home to millions of English subjects who often had differing views on religious questions. And now I'm flattening this a little bit. I'm reducing this to kind of more of a generalization. But on one end of the spectrum, you had what you might call high church Anglicans who favored a more Catholic approach to worship in this increasingly Protestant Church of England. And on the other end, you had people who had embraced the beliefs of Reformed Christianity, the teachings of men like John Calvin, who argued that those Catholic elements had to be purified out of the Church of England, stripped away. And what do you suppose they called the men and women who called for the purification of the English church? The Puritans. So the Puritan movement in England sought to purify the Church of England of its Catholic heritage. Tensions between these factions helped contribute to the English Civil War by the 1640s. But I want to make it really clear that the Puritans did not challenge the idea that there should be a relationship between the church and the state. They were on board with that. Right? They weren't calling for religious toleration. They weren't calling for religious freedom. They were calling for the character of English Christianity to become more Protestant, but they still wanted that tight connection between church and state to exist. 1630, a group of English Puritans come to New England and found the Massachusetts Bay Colony, right? John Winthrop here is, of course, one of the most famous leaders of this colony in the 17th century. Technically, these are still members of the Church of England, right? But part of the Puritan movement. These settlers hoped to build a model Christian society in America that would serve as what the governor, John Winthrop, called, quote, a city on a hill, right? An example for the rest of English society to see. This is what they could become, right? So Winthrop and the Puritans aren't seeking to flee. They're not trying to break away from the Church of England. They're seeking to build something, an example of what the Church of England should become, right there in America. They have a sense of mission, and they believed that they had what they called a covenant with God, that they had an agreement with God, that if they honored his commandments and his teachings, he would look favorably upon this experiment. But the flip side of that was the belief that if they failed, they would be made an example of as well, right? That they would be visited by Indian attacks, their crops would fail, their children would suffer, right? That failure to live up to this covenant with God came with consequences. And this belief in a covenant with God informed their approach to governance. Government in law in Massachusetts Bay reflected the Puritans' belief that they had this covenant, and in many ways it was similar to that in Virginia. Tax support for their churches, laws requiring attendance, and crimes, laws against crimes of what they saw as morality. In many respects, they're trying to construct what they saw as a more perfect society. Again, much like in England, this does not mean that they were a place of religious toleration. They wanted to build a very specific version of a city on a hill. And people who dissented from that were often treated quite harshly if they were loud and public and persistent in that dissent. A classic example are my favorite troublemakers of the 17th century, the Quakers, right? Quakers came to New England after the English Civil War, and they evangelized loudly and provocatively. They would interrupt church services. They kept coming back, and they let women talk about religion. I mean, they did all sorts of things, right, that upset the mores of Puritan society. And infamously, in 1659, Massachusetts government executed a group of Quakers whose only crime was continuing to preach in public to disrupt congregational worship services. One of their number was pardoned at the gallows. Her name was Mary Dyer. And she came back 6 months later, continuing to preach, and then they put her to death. So this is an extreme example, and not necessarily typical, but it illustrates that this is not necessarily a place of religious toleration in New England. Now, to kind of bring this section to a close, after the 1688 ascension of William and Mary in England, Virginia, and Massachusetts temper their dealings with dissenting Protestants. So when I say dissenting Protestants, I mean people who are in that Protestant umbrella, but who disagree with the Church of England. I'm talking about Baptists and Presbyterians and Calvinists and such. Dissenting Protestants could buy licenses to preach in Virginia, right? They could pay a fee, and then they would be able to preach, and that way the state, the colony I should say, could regulate how many were operating in the province at a given time. And as the colony grew westward, governors like William Gooch in Virginia offered generous grants of land and the promise of religious toleration to European Protestants to settle in places like the Shenandoah Valley. This created a nice buffer between Anglican Virginians in the Tidewater and French Catholics and Indians to the west. But these groups still had to pay a tax to support the Anglican establishment. You might be a Mennonite living in the Shenandoah Valley, but you still have to pay a tax to support the Anglican Church. And if you want to get married with a minister, and you want that to be recognized by the colonial government, guess what? You've got to do it before an Anglican parson. Right?
Wow.
Big idea 3. 3 out of 5. There were colonies that offered more religious toleration, but for different reasons. And I'm going to suggest to you that some of these colonies offered it out of a sense of pragmatism, because they kind of had to, and other colonies offered religious toleration out of a sense of principle. First example I want to note is my own home state of Maryland, as we say, right? Maryland was founded in 1634 as a proprietary colony. That means rather than being established by a company like Virginia or Massachusetts, proprietary colony is gifted by the king to a family. It's granted to a specific family. And in this case, it was the Calvert family, English nobility and Catholics, right, which put them at odds with the official establishment in England, right? It created a measure of tension. In establishing Maryland, the Calverts hoped to create a place where their fellow English Catholics could enjoy the ability to worship openly without being persecuted in England, without having to pay a special tax to support a church they didn't believe in. But the Calverts also recognized that the Catholics in Maryland would always be a minority, and that likely most of the colonists who would come to that colony would be Protestant. This created a fair amount of religious tension in Maryland. And it's important to note that at the same time, 1640s, the English Civil War is beginning to take place, right? So that tension between these religious factions in England is spilling over into Maryland, where there's a Catholic elite leading the colony and a majority of Protestant Englishmen living and working in the colony. By 1649, the situation in Maryland was contentious enough, and England was on the verge of civil war, that the Catholics in the government of Maryland passed something called the Act Concerning Religion. And the Act Concerning Religion forbade religious persecution and promised all Christians, quote, free exercise of their faith. It punished anyone who accused others of heresy or idolatry with a fine and public whipping, and it outlawed religious slurs against various groups. You call someone a papist, that's a whipping. You call someone a schismatic, right, that's a fine, right? But their goal was to create a space where Christians could worship without the fear of reprisal, without the fear of violence or persecution. However, it also punished anyone who would deny the Holy Trinity, anyone who blasphemed the Virgin Mary. And it did not extend this religious toleration to Jews, to Muslims, or anyone else. So the ability to worship as a Baptist or a Catholic, yes. The ability to not worship as a Christian, no. And in many ways, this legislation was motivated by fears among Catholics in Maryland that if the tide turned against them, as it seemed to do, that the Protestants might eliminate their ability to worship openly as Catholics in Maryland. And so they passed a law that gave them legal shelter, right, to be able to worship. Maryland's Act of Concerning Religion is significant, right, in that it offers this vision of religion in a colony that isn't tied to one state-sanctioned church. But it's also important to note that this was an act of pragmatism, not necessarily an act in the belief that religious freedom is like intrinsically good. By 1715, Maryland had become an Anglican colony, and the Calvert family converted from Catholicism to the Church of England in order to survive politically, in order to hold on to their colony. So this experiment in religious toleration in Maryland was born of pragmatism, and it was also temporary. Pennsylvania and Rhode Island offer a different view of what religious toleration might mean. Rhode Island was founded by a Puritan named Roger Williams and his followers in 1636, after they were exiled. That is William. That's good. All right, this is Roger Williams. Rhode Island's founded by Roger Williams and his followers after they're exiled from Massachusetts for challenging the authority of the Massachusetts established church, right? Roger Williams and his followers said that the government should not get in between the people and God, that covenant isn't between the state and God, like the Puritans argued, but that it's between the individual person and God. And so the government might corrupt someone's sense of religion. It might corrupt their sense of faith by forcing them to worship in a way that was against their conscience. For John Winthrop and the people of Massachusetts, the government of Massachusetts, this was heresy, and this was dangerous because it threatened the stability of the colony. So they kick him out. He establishes the colony of Rhode Island to the south. And in Rhode Island, Williams promoted this idea that people ought to be able to worship however they wanted to, right? Have whatever relationship they wanted to with God, rather than a religious establishment enforced by the state. That meant that there was no established church in Rhode Island, and the laws did not insist on attendance. You didn't have to go to church if you didn't want to. The state wouldn't punish you for not showing up every few weeks. Protestant dissenters were welcome, and even Jews found a place to worship in Rhode Island. To the south, the last English colony to be established in the 1600s, Pennsylvania, was another colony that experimented with religious freedom. This was another proprietary colony, like Maryland, right? Another colony granted to a family. William Penn, who was given this colony, was a Quaker, right? One of those groups that had challenged the Puritans in New England earlier in the century. And as a Quaker, he believed that every human being had this thing called the inner light, had a bit of the light that God shed in within them, and that inner light made all people, men as well as women, Africans as well as Englishmen, equal. And so, believing then that people shouldn't be persecuted for worshiping as they would, that people have the ability to pursue that revelation individually, the laws of Pennsylvania forbade religious persecution and also did not establish any one church over another. Penn hoped that Pennsylvania would become a place that his fellow Quakers could seek refuge. However, there were limits. Jews were barred from office because they couldn't swear an oath affirming their belief in the divinity of Jesus. And there were still laws enforcing public morality, like in Virginia and Massachusetts. You couldn't be drunk in public and disorderly. Swearing and adultery were still crimes, suggesting that religion still influenced the morality of the law, even if people weren't forced to attend one church over another. One of the consequences of this experiment in religious toleration was it helped spur on a more diverse population in Pennsylvania. Protestant dissenters of all types came to Pennsylvania because they could worship freely. Catholics came there because they could worship freely. And groups from Europe, like the Mennonites and like the Amish, for which southern Pennsylvania remains famous, right? They settled there because they're able to worship freely. Fourth idea out of 5. Tried to establish this idea that there were established churches supported by the state, but at the same time there were some examples of religious toleration in the colonies, whether that was motivated by principles or pragmatism. Fourth big idea is that revivalism, Great Awakening, challenged the religious establishment in the mid-18th century. So a series of religious revivals swept across British North America in the 1730s and 40s. And these revivals spurred the growth of what became known as evangelical Christianity. Thousands of men and women claimed to have been born again after very emotional appeals by traveling, also known as itinerant ministers like George Whitefield. The emphasis that revivalist ministers like Whitefield placed was on this idea of an individual making a choice to convert. Rather than being baptized at birth, rather than being trained in the catechism, and conversion being a process that might play out over months or years of formation, for evangelicals like Whitefield, conversion took place in a moment, when one realized their utter dependence upon God's grace and had an emotional conversion experience that made them born again and turned to God for mercy. These revivals brought religious enthusiasm and faith to thousands, but they also challenged the established churches. The arrival of itinerant traveling ministers or the arrival of a revival divided congregations, right? Groups might leave the established church that had been there for generations to follow this new minister or to join a revival, right? Many of these ministers refused to pay for a license to preach, believing that the religious establishment had no authority to force them to do that. And they otherwise challenged the churches that were established by law. Perhaps most infamously, in Virginia, the arrival of a group called the Separate Baptists in the 1760s and 70s provoked a strong reaction from the religious establishment. Baptists preached a message of spiritual equality, claiming that everyone was equal in their sinfulness and in their ability to be saved, and for a society that had a rigid hierarchy of white over black, of gentlemen over freeholders, over servants and slaves. This idea that everyone was spiritually equal was blasphemy, right? They also balked at paying deference to these gentlemen planters who made up the government of Virginia and also sat on the vestries of Virginia's churches. Separate Baptist ministers refused to pay for licenses to preach, and they often challenged the authority of Anglican ministers, suggesting that they were unconverted themselves, that they preached to dead audiences, right? That they lacked conviction. And the reaction was often violent. In Culpeper, James Ireland was jailed for preaching without a license, and when he continued to preach from behind bars, mounted gentlemen came and broke up the crowd that was listening to him, urinated on Ireland, spat on him, and otherwise defaced him in an attempt to undermine his message. In 1771, another Baptist minister was attacked while preaching by an Anglican minister who dragged him from the pulpit of his church and then had him horsewhipped by a magistrate in front of the congregation. So the revivalism of the 18th century energized worship for many, but it also introduced a challenge to established churches by encouraging people to worship outside of the official church and by empowering ministers who were not connected to the state. It also encouraged men and women to make individual choices, right? To have that internal conversion experience rather than turning to an established church for help and formation and turning to God. And historians have suggested that culturally, the Great Awakening may have in some ways become a precondition for the Revolution, encouraging men and women to challenge older authorities and to be prepared to make individual decisions themselves. Last major point. You gotta talk about the American Revolution at least a little bit, right? The American Revolution represented more than just a bid for independence, but it was also an internal revolution that unsettled long-standing assumptions about colonial society, including the relationship between the church and the state. Right? Independence, when it came in 1783, broke that special place the Church of England had in colonies like Virginia, Massachusetts, and in others, right? The 1776 Virginia Declaration of Rights spoke to this. Authored by George Mason, the Declaration of Rights named the right to worship according to conscience prominently in its language, right? The religion or the duty which we owe our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence, like an established church might be able to do. And therefore, all men are equally entitled to the free exercise, echoing those words from Maryland's Act Concerning Religion from 140 years earlier, according to the dictates of conscience, and that is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. As states remade their constitutions during the Revolution, and they did, right? It wasn't just a war for independence, but within what was becoming the United States, they were experimenting with what self-government should look like, right? They were reshaping the laws and the governments of the colonies as they became states and trying to perfect how that would work. And as this happened, these new states began to adopt free exercise, repealing colonial era laws that would have led to punishments for a lack of church attendance. The end of tax support came more slowly. Massachusetts, maybe not surprisingly, was the last state to give up tax support for a chosen church. Does anyone want to hazard a guess as to when Massachusetts ended tax support for its congregational churches? 1833. The First Amendment to the Constitution reflected this belief in free exercise and the weakening of the church establishment as well. Right? The First Amendment promises, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's all it says. So it reflects this trend that had begun in the states during the Revolution, guaranteeing that the federal government, that the national government, would not establish a national church protected by laws, that it wouldn't tax Americans to support that national church, right? And that it guaranteed free exercise. Yet, well into the 19th century, state laws, still informed by religious morality, punished blasphemy and various sexual transgressions as defined by the churches. In fact, religious tests for office, banned by the Constitution of the United States. Right? A religious test for office is where you have to swear an oath, right, upon the Bible or upon a text, right, claiming that you believe in this or that as a requisite, right, for assuming an office. The Constitution says you cannot administer a religious test for office for a federal office. But it wasn't until the Supreme Court ruled this unconstitutional in 1961 that states ended the practice of administering religious tests for office. So what I want you to consider is that this story it's kind of complicated. You know, the federalism of the United States, the differences between national and state authority come into play when we talk about that separation between church and state and where each has its place in American society. What the First Amendment granted for the national government wasn't always what the state governments promised. So, as I leave you, what I'd like to suggest is that America's religious past is important to a fuller understanding of early American history. Religion profoundly shaped the reasons why many came to the colonies, and it profoundly shaped the culture and the laws of the colonies as they evolved from the 1600s to the 1700s and became states. And it's important not to flatten this history by reducing it to platitudes about the United States and its colonies having always been a Christian nation. Or it's important not to flatten it by saying that there had always been this belief in a strict separation, a wall between church and state. Each colony was different. And the religious culture of those colonies changed over time, right? Over almost 200 years. Close church-state relations were common, but not universal in a colonial America. It was a source of support for social services, for charity, and it was seen as a bastion of public morality. But it could also be a source for oppression, oppressing religious minorities who were forced to pay taxes and attend churches they didn't agree with, at the very least. So, you know, because a good historian shows the sources, I'm going to put up this here in closing. You don't have to take notes, but if American religious history is something you are interested in and you want like a beginning, like something to read as a good introduction, I would suggest starting with Kid, third from the bottom. That's a good starting point. And the rest, I think, are also excellent books that I use to help shape this talk. So thank you for your time today.